Hello, everyone. Good to have you all at the Berman Institute Biweekly Seminar. I'm Jeff Kahn. For those of you who don't know me, I'm director of the Berman Institute of Bioethics here at Johns Hopkins. Great pleasure today to welcome our friend and colleague, Jim Lavery, who will be introduced by my colleague, Jolie, in a moment. But let me just say my welcome. Thanks, everybody, for joining. And thanks, Jim, so much for being willing to be with us today. We're looking very much forward to your comments and the discussion to follow. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe, who as chair of the Berman Institute Seminar Committee gets the pleasure and honor of introducing and hosting our seminar today. Joe.
Thanks
very much, Jeff, and welcome, Jim. It's great to have you join us today for the seminar. So I do have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Dr. Jim Lavery, who is the inaugural Conrad N. Hilton Chair in Global Health Ethics and a professor in the Hubert Department of Global Health at the Rawlings School of Public Health in Atlanta at Emory University. Prior to joining Emory's faculty, Jim was a research scientist and managing director of the Center for Ethical, Social, and Cultural Risks at the Li Ka-shing Knowledge Institute at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, an associate professor in the School of Public Health, also there at the University of Toronto. Jim, being Canadian by origin, also studied in Canada at the University of Toronto, completing his master's in public health degrees from the Institute of Medical Science and the Center for Bioethics at the University of Toronto. He also completed a postdoc training at Queen's University and has since been working, well, prior to that, after completing his postdoc, spent 3 years at the Fogarty International Center, where some of us also interacted with Jim in his work there as sort of helping the NIH develop its policy in relation to bioethics internationally. But most recently, Jim, I think, it served as a PI on an important project that involved the ethical, social, and cultural implications program with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That was from 2005 to 2015. He's a fellow of the Hastings Center and has made a number of different contributions in bioethics and global health ethics over the years. And more recently has been working with as a member of the board of directors for CORED, or the Council for Health Development and Research and Development in the US. And as the technical advisory committee chair for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Jim, we're really enthused to have you join us and to sort of share your work, and specifically on the topic of today's seminar, which is fair partnerships as a determinant of effectiveness of global health campaigns and implications for research ethics. So thanks, Jim, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Joe and Jeff and Suzanne and everyone that has contributed to bring me here. I really appreciate it. It's always just a lovely experience to visit Baltimore, this time virtually, and so many great friends over the years in Baltimore. So before I start, just a couple of sort of disclaimers. You know, I'm not a philosopher. I struggle with the label of ethicist. I'm not really quite sure what I do. I'm sort of trained more the way you would be trained as a qualitative sociologist, and with a real interest in policy. And in our work, I think what we're really grappling with at the moment, and what I'm going to try to walk you through today, is a real interest in how to, make this transition from the conceptual framings that we use and the procedures that we use in research ethics, and how to drive those more convincingly into the real world. And that's what we're kind of occupied with at the moment, and that's what I'm going to try to share some thoughts with you today about. So a quick overview. I'm going to spend a few minutes just laying out what I think of as the dominant research ethics paradigm, just a sketch of that. And then I want to talk about what I see as some critical gaps in the dominant paradigm. And I'm going to talk briefly about implementation science as a kind of context for this, but I want to focus on the ethics of stakeholder engagement and fairness in research partnerships as two really critical gaps that I think we need to do better at in the dominant paradigm in research ethics. And then I wanted to share a couple of examples of our efforts to expand the scope and impact of research ethics and global health ethics by incorporating stakeholder engagement and fair partnerships into global health programming. This is my awesome team at Emory. I've only been down here for 4 years, but these guys have just made it a joy and made all of this work possible. So just a call out to all of them as I get started here. So I want to just take a few minutes about the dominant paradigm of research ethics and global health. So there are probably few places on Earth that need less of a background in the narratives and stories of research ethics and all of the kind of egregious violations that have happened than the Berman Institute. But so I'm going to start instead of reciting Nuremberg and Tuskegee and such. I want to start with a policy brief that I was asked to write back in 2004 by Determinant about challenges in regulating international research with human subjects. And the argument that I made here was that the US Common Rule regulations really had started to achieve an incredible reach in the world, and were really having a very strong influence on the way that research ethics thinking was being promulgated around the world. And these are old data, but it actually doesn't matter. The point is still clear. If you look at OHRP, just to finish the previous point, there are thousands of IRBs or institutional review boards in more than 125 countries, and literally thousands of institutions that have federal-wide assurances or legal promises in effect with the US federal government through the Office for Human Research Protections, committing to following or complying with the Common Rule regulations if they're in receipt of US federal government funding for research. And so in that Determinant piece, I made the argument that the Common Rule has become a kind of de facto international standard. And that's the core of what I'm going to try to characterize as the dominant paradigm. Of course, I'm completely aware of all the other guidelines and all the things that are run around peripherally, but they have various types of authority and legitimacy, whereas the Common Rule requirements are, in a regulatory way, are more binding, and even in foreign countries that where it's not clear that those regulations can be applied legally, it doesn't matter, because if you want the money, then you have to follow the guidelines. So I'm just going to pick up on that as the kind of dominant paradigm, and I want to take a few minutes to walk through this table, because this is my own kind of take on the features of this paradigm that's characterized by the Common Rule. So first, it's a responsive paradigm. It's responsive to Nuremberg, to Henry Beecher, to Tuskegee, and all of the things that had happened previously that were real violations and that needed to be improved or dealt with. And in that sense, it's a corrective paradigm. So starting with Nuremberg, there was this need to ensure the voluntary participation of people in research, and also a need to address the roles and responsibilities of institutions in previous violations, which was another kind of prominent, maybe less well known aspect of Nuremberg. It's an institutional paradigm. So the Common Rule is primarily a policy of institutional accountability rather than research ethics guidance for investigators. It's a protective paradigm. So the emphasis is on protections, and in fact in OHRP it's protections, procedures, rather than protection more comprehensively, rather than substantive guidance. It's a regulatory paradigm, so the emphasis is on compliance with rules and preset procedures. It's been argued by a number of people that it's an acontextual paradigm. In other words, essentially all research methods and research contexts are treated the same. So some have argued that it's a kind of a universalist paradigm. It's a paradigm that's been industrialized now. There are standardized processes. It has been professionalized. We now have professionals who are IRB professionals and in work in those contexts and professional capacities. And we also now have accreditation of institutions. And in my view, it's a pretty fixed paradigm. It really doesn't evolve with experience or evidence or analysis. So 25 years, after 25 years, the revision of the common rule that happened in 2019 resulted in very little change to the actual structure or basic features of the paradigm. And finally, it's a highly individualistic paradigm. So there's an almost exclusive focus on individual research participants and no guidance for ethical obligations beyond research participants, people who may be affected in other ways by research. So in the preamble to the final rule that I just alluded to in 2019, it says, because of shifts in science, technology, and public engagement and expectations, a wide range of stakeholders have raised concerns about the limitations of the existing regulatory framework, arguing for a reevaluation of how the fundamental principles of the 1979 Belmont Report that underlie the common rule, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, are applied in practice to the myriad new contexts in which US research is conducted in the 21st century. So I wrote a paper a few years ago using this idea of wicked problems and arguing that many problems that we confront in research ethics are actually wicked problems. They're complex socially, operationally, and administratively, as well as ethically. But we still tend to respond with standardized forms of reasoning, for example, the application of abstract principles or highly structured procedural reviews, and we tend not to evaluate the impact of these approaches or the recommendations that we make to investigators who are seeking approval through IRBs, for example. And so we don't have a good understanding of what impact our research ethics review paradigm is having on the problems that we encounter. Now, I should say before I move on, the research ethics academic literature is just an astonishingly rich literature, and it may be one of the places in the world where there's the biggest gap between practice and the really brilliant thinking that's reflected in the research ethics literature. So that's not my focus. It's really more on the practice of the paradigm. So I want to just lay out what I see as some critical gaps that I'm going to pick up on the rest of the talk. So if we think about the dominant paradigm as what I just described, and if you will just suspend disbelief and agree with me for now that makes sense, I want to focus on two main elements that have shown up a lot in my work over the last 20 years, and that I think are critically important context for ethical thinking, but that are poorly reflected still in the dominant paradigm. And those are stakeholder engagement and fairness in research partnerships. I think the current relationships, if you'll accept the Venn diagram of visual reasoning, I think there's a little bit of stakeholder engagement that's reflected in the dominant paradigm. Certainly, a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the narrative invokes stakeholder engagement a lot. But in a few places, it's starting to become put into practice in more concrete ways. Of course, in some places, like in HIV prevention trials, it's been a long-standing practice, and it's been quite well worn. But that I think is an exception. Fairness in research partnerships, I think, is a different relationship. I think there's some overlap with stakeholder engagement in that literature, but I think there's very, very little overlap, if any, with that dominant paradigm that I just described. And so what we're really interested in our work is, how do you start integrating these, layering them on one another, and trying to see whether we can be adding value by paying attention to fairness in research partnerships and stakeholder engagement. And this is not to try to obscure the dominant paradigm or get rid of it, but to look at where there are gaps that really need some complementary development, and maybe in ways that would also illuminate some ways to actually revise or refine the dominant paradigm or improve it. And the argument that I'm going to be laying out for you is that by doing this, by layering these things together and really building our understanding of how they work together, that we can produce what what we like to refer to as a learning ecosystem to improve the ethics and value of research. And so I want to turn now to just a couple of quick thoughts about implementation science. So January 30th was World NTD Day. Most of our work at the moment focuses on NTDs and focuses even more specifically on the design, management, and evaluation of mass drug administration campaigns in the context of lymphatic filariasis, our work in Haiti, and on onchocerciasis and our work in Mali and Senegal. So implementation science is this kind of weird space. There are lots of different ways of thinking, lots of different attitudes about it. Some are positive, some are less positive. But this is just a recent paper talking about a synthesis of all the different frameworks that go along. I think the easiest way to think about it is the London, underground, the tube symbol of, it's about trying to bridge this gap between what we know and what we do. So slightly more formally, it's about moving from the generation of evidence and the things that we classically or typically refer to as research into the things that we typically refer to as practice, and crossing this terrain. So all roads lead through Baltimore. And so I'm not sure if Ruth or Nancy are on the call today, but this is one of their papers from a few years ago that lays out this framework, an ethical framework for learning healthcare systems. And I want to just pick up on a quote from that paper. So it says quality improvement in comparative effectiveness research. Again, just thinking about the figure I just showed you, bring into sharp relief the problems with the criteria traditionally used to distinguish research and practice. The fuzziness of the distinction, coupled with the oversight burdens that are required of research but not of practice, creates dubious incentives to redesign quality improvement and comparative effectiveness activities in ways that minimize the likelihood that they will be classified as research, even at the cost of their rigor, utility, dissemination, or value. The traditional model now stands to frustrate integrated real-time learning, which is at the heart of where our healthcare system should be headed. So for me, when I read this paper first, there were really these two dimensions. One was this kind of long-standing and frustrating challenge of the either or problem. Something is either research or its implementation or public health practice, when clearly the dimensions of both are together in a kind of hybrid. And so the paper speaks to that. But one of the real take-homes for me was this idea that learning is an ethical imperative. And even if something isn't characterized as research by definition, that learning is still a critically important function for any implementation, and even an ethically necessary function. So if you stay with the reasoning here, then, so what we're trying to sort out is, can we figure out how to develop more of a learning ecosystem about how ethics functions in research and implementation? And what if we were to try to overlay that or introduce that in the context of implementation research or these kind of hybrid implementation programs? And what we're arguing is that we think that there's a unique opportunity to both expand the scope of research ethics, but also improve its impact in global health if we can try to sort out how to do some of this. So that's the kind of context. We're still in this idea about what are the gaps in the dominant paradigm. And so I want to talk for a second about the ethics of stakeholder engagement, which I think is a particular gap still, and something that encouragingly has seen an awful lot more activity over the last 10 years or so. So I always go back to this slide from 2011 from the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, Moral Science, Protecting Participants in Human Subjects Research. And in this document, it says that community engagement has emerged as a response to the practical challenges of conducting research in a wide range of social, political, and economic circumstances around the world. And so what it's saying is, if you look at this report and all these kind of really complex things that we are being faced with, that community engagement just seems like a useful way to think about this. And then it doesn't say anything else. And I think in some ways that's really emblematic of the way that these issues have been dealt with. They're just dealt with almost as if they're self-evident, and in fact, nothing could be further from the truth in my mind. So, why isn't stakeholder engagement a central focus of the dominant paradigm? So, and this isn't exhaustive, but just a few thoughts. First, the paradigm intentionally, and I think also very reasonably in many ways, focuses on the protection of individual research participants. This provides a clearer and a more linear logic for institutional accountabilities, especially, which again is one of the features of the paradigm, that it's a framework of institutional accountabilities primarily. But it's a far more complex problem, I think, to sort out the relevant nature and scope of the obligations to stakeholders beyond those of individual participants, and who should hold those obligations and accountabilities, and why they should hold those obligations, and to what extent, to what the scope of those obligations, and where does the authority and ultimate responsibility lie for these kinds of obligations and accountabilities. So for those and many other reasons, I think we shouldn't be surprised that stakeholder engagement didn't kind of make it into the final cut, if you like, of the dominant paradigm. So this is a paper I wrote a couple of years ago now, talking about the challenges with stakeholder engagement, and in particular, some of the challenges about building an evidence base. And here are just a few points that I made in that paper. One is that there's a really high degree of variability in the whole stakeholder engagement space, in concepts, in the language that we use, in the models that we invoke. And we tend to settle on what I think are quite narrow conceptualizations of stakeholder engagement. Community advisory boards is a classic example. And when people talk about stakeholder and community engagement, they very, very frequently focus disproportionately on communications as the core goal. There's a lack of agreement on a coherent and comprehensive construct of stakeholder engagement. What is it and how does it work? There's actually a lot of literature out there, but there really isn't a very solid agreement on one particular dominant way of thinking about how to do this stuff. And most important for my points today, there's still, I think, a lack of agreement on the ethical goals and value of stakeholder engagement. This turns out to be actually quite a challenging issue. We have, Jeremy Sugarman has written about this, and a number of us have been kind of taking a crack at this for a while to try to peel away some of the layers. But I want to just talk briefly about one example of this from a paper that we wrote, and I think I saw Mariah's name on here. So hi, Mariah. This is an opportunity for Mariah and I to work together years ago with Kathy King, who was also a postdoc at Hopkins. And this paper is called Community Engagement in the Human Infrastructure of Global Health Research. Here we characterized a stakeholder as an individual or organization whose interests may be affected by the conduct and or the outcomes of the research program. And we talked about engagement as the set of interactions and relationships through which researchers learn about stakeholder interests, about how stakeholder interests might be affected by the research program, either produce harm, set those interests back, or create harm, create value for the stakeholders or have no effect or neutral effect, and learn about whether stakeholder interests create specific obligations for the researchers or funders and how to execute those obligations, and also learn about how stakeholders would like to be or should be engaged or involved in the activities in question. And one of the points that we make that isn't alluded to in the title is that we say that the relationships between the researcher and the community extend beyond the normal bounds of the researcher-research participant encounter and are the foundation of meaningful engagement. These relationships create an essential human infrastructure, a web of relationships between researchers and the stakeholder community. Again, the sort of central importance of relationships it was not a novel idea then, it's not a novel idea now, but it's how to think about the way that relationships actually function in the context of these activities, I think, that we were trying to get our minds at. So now I just want to walk you briefly through the logic of the model that we came up with. I think lots of it is still very, very relevant, and I'll show you how we're picking up on some parts of it to expand. So we start off in the bottom. These are the three goals that we articulated in the paper. The first is to identify and respond to non-obvious stakeholder interests and contextual factors. And the thinking there is that there's really no need to do a lot of digging to find out obvious interests, but it's often those less obvious interests that are the ones that lead to challenges. So the first point then is to generate insights about what interests are at stake and the potential value of the program for stakeholders. The second point is to figure out this really difficult challenge of extending the idea of respect beyond the individual. And part of that is to acknowledge and be responsive to the community of stakeholders. So avoiding what we characterized as the harm of disregard, just not acknowledging that people actually do hold legitimate interests. That design and adopt approaches that account for and safeguard stakeholder interests. So avoiding harm, identifying opportunities to create value for stakeholders, and then demonstrating trustworthiness and fairness in process and partnership. Again, ideas that we will come back to in a couple of minutes. And the final goal is to build the legitimacy of the research project by creating opportunities for dialogue and deliberation, by providing reasons or justification, or critically examining some of the assumptions that underlie the logic of the program. And finally, this idea of establishing a human infrastructure of relationships with stakeholders. And I think the point there was to try to view it that way, rather than just consents that need to be sought, to really look at it as an infrastructure of human relationships. So, oh, I'm sorry, I glossed over that last one. Let me go back. I wanted to feel the text highlighted in red at the bottom. I wanted to pick up on that text, and also in the top right about this fairness in process and partnership. That one should be in red as well. These are a couple of the ideas that we've picked up and are trying to kind of move forward in a little bit more detail in our current work. So this guy is an incredibly cool guy. His name is R. Edward Freeman. He's a philosopher. I think he's at University of Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. But he hangs out in a business school, and he writes books like this: Stakeholder Theory, Strategic Management. So he's in that kind of space. And I think it's a space that we tend to just not pay enough attention to, because it happens to be in strategic management in the business world. I think we get a little put off, and we don't look carefully enough at what I think is some really, really excellent thinking. And he's talking about companies, but here is a quote from his book, Stakeholder Theory, The State of the Art. He says, to create value, firms need to see the world through the eyes of their multiple stakeholders and be able to harness not only the resources their stakeholders control, but also the information and insights that these stakeholders can provide. These insights and information will enable firms to find new ways of creating value and grow the value pie for all to share. So I mean, optimistic, which is good, but this real emphasis on the need to have a focus on building value for stakeholders. So building value, I mean, this is not a crazy idea in research ethics. Go back to Benji Friedman and initial paper and scientific value and validity as ethical requirements for research, where he says the experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by any other methods or means of study, and not random or unnecessary in nature. Excuse me. And in the sort of classic "What Makes Clinical Research Ethical," which I think might be the most highly cited bioethics paper of all time by Zeke and Dave Wendler and Chris Grady, the social or scientific value is in fact the lead criterion, the lead principle, if you like, and yet it hasn't managed to find its way into day-to-day practice very well in the dominant paradigm. And even when we move to looking at global health context, Jack Killen, when Mariah and I were in the department together when Jack Killen joined us from NIAID, and they worked on this paper at that time, and adding collaborative partnership was a really big deal, but social value was a critical piece in that model as well. So stakeholder theory then, it's about how to create value for stakeholders. Value is determined in stakeholder theory according to the specific interests of each stakeholder. Stakeholder engagement offers a feasible and a realistic way to determine the value of the research for all relevant stakeholders, including research participants, partners, policymakers, and others whose interests may be affected positively or negatively by the research. And stakeholder engagement offers, I think, a more effective and realistic way to determine the value of research for relevant stakeholders than the standard metrics that we usually use, which are mostly about us. They're usually about publications and citation rates and impact factors. Now, just a point of clarification. When I say that it offers a feasible and realistic way to do these things, nowhere in the text does it say that it's easy. These are really, really complex things. And because I'm in Atlanta now, I usually use the example of Coca-Cola. And before COVID, Coca-Cola spent something like 22 or 23% of its total operating capital on stakeholder, customer relationship management and customer experience management throughout its value chain. And so is it feasible? Yes, it's feasible. But we just have never seen anything like that kind of investment that happens in the private sector, because value kind of plays out quite differently for those of us working in public health than it does for a big company like Coca-Cola. And now back for a second then to implementation research. And this is just a Lancet review from a few years ago as well. But one of the points is that, inherent in the concept of implementation science is the requirement that we view research programs as value creation strategies, not just evidence creation strategies. So again, this idea about value is prominent, even though we have kind of struggled to figure out how to bring it to life. And so a key question then arises, at least for us in the kind of work that we're trying to do. Can implementation science be funded and designed and managed and evaluated in ways that enable researchers to be more responsive to stakeholder interests? So those are some of the questions that we're trying to work through. And back to that science paper for a second. In that paper, I advocated a shift from a social science orientation for stakeholder engagement to a strategic management orientation in research programs. And I argued that stakeholder engagement is actually highly developed in strategic management approaches, including, as I've already mentioned, customer relationship management, customer experience management, and human-centered design. And these actually produce what we call in our work actionable insights or design parameters that allow strategies to create value and safeguard stakeholder and company interests. And companies usually have flexibility in the budgets and protocols and workflows and the appropriate processes to be responsive to stakeholder interests. Whereas in research, the main instruments of responsiveness that we have are usually budgets and protocols, and they're usually locked down at the start of a project, and you go 5 years with very, very little revision to those. So one interesting point, I got bashed for this paper by a lot, even friends and colleagues. A lot of people said, you're going to the dark side. You're talking about business, and you're trying to commercialize public health. And so I'm always confused by how difficult it seems to be for us to look critically and intelligently at other areas where people have thought about exactly the same things and draw ideas without getting canceled, I guess. That wasn't quite full cancellation, but I was surprised at some of the feedback that I got from colleagues about this paper. I'm not the only one, obviously, focusing on these things. From the same year, in fact, this piece in Nature, and it was actually a report from people at the International Development Research Center in Ottawa that was describing a new tool for precisely what we're talking about, for judging the value of science for stakeholders and its scientific validity. And they talk about the crucial role of stakeholders and users in determining whether research is salient and legitimate. And it focuses attention on how well scientists position their research for use, given the mounting understanding that uptake and influence begins during the research process, not only after the research process. And then just months later, an entire special issue of Nature was dedicated to knowledge co-production and research, and this whole idea of turning the tables a bit and recognizing, acknowledging the incredible tacit knowledge and wisdom that lies in the publics that we deal with, and how we should think differently about eliciting those insights and that wisdom from publics. So that's just a kind of really quick blur through some thinking about the ethics of stakeholder engagement. The next critical gap, I think, is fairness in research partnerships. And maybe before I start, just one kind of quick comment on why this has become such a prominent issue for me personally. When I started at NIH, I was working at the Fogarty International Center, and I got assigned very quickly to be the consulting bioethicist on a number of NIH networks and a number of collaborative agreements between NIH and investigators. And I found myself out in the field, meeting with partners in various places. And, I just thought I was a really popular guy, because after pretty well every meeting, people would ask me, hey, do you want to go for a beer and, go in the village and have a beer? And I'm like, yeah, this is great, And then, of course, we get to the bar, and the investigators, the partners, they would all start complaining to me about how their salaries were lower. They hadn't seen budgets. They had no support for IP considerations. They were concerned about authorship issues. And so over many, many, many years, I realized that being a bioethicist was a portal for people to come and share some of these concerns about fairness in the partnerships that I was consulting to. And in fact, I would do my best to communicate these things, but they were kind of out of scope of the normal conventional concerns that we were supposed to be commenting on. So the idea about partnerships in global health research is not new. This is Anthony Costello and Ali Zumla from 2000, which was actually the year I started at Fogarty. And they make the points that a lot of foreign-led research in developing countries remains semi-colonial in nature and may have negative effects on partner countries. That annexed site research led by expats should be phased out and replaced by a partnership model in which nationals lead research projects with only technical support from outsiders. And that research funded through national academics and institutions may actually improve the chances of findings being translated into national policy and practice. And that the principles of an equal research partnership actually need to be monitored and taken seriously and given weight and consideration by funding agencies. And so again, I've already shown you this paper about what makes clinical research in developing countries ethical, and the benchmarks paper. And again, I highlighted it before, but the paper picks up and adds collaborative partnership, which wasn't in the original 7 principle paper that I showed you a few minutes ago as well, just in general, what makes research ethical. And so one point, just for illustration, from what's highlighted in yellow is to involve partners in sharing responsibilities for determining the importance of the health problem, assessing the value of the research. And again, coming back to implementation research, this Lancet paper also talks about, it says implementation research involves partnerships across the research and implementation cycles with co-production and concurrent use of knowledge. Dissemination alone is not sufficient to support real change. The core characteristics of implementation research include the nurturing of trusting partnerships to do real-world, real-time research that addresses relevant implementation challenges. So, the point here is, and the reason to show you so much language in these slides is that the language is all just heavily infused with these ethical ideas about fairness and partnerships and trustworthiness and things that I think all have a lot of ethical import. So fair partnerships then, there's a growing recognition that partnerships are ethically significant. I think we all kind of know that intuitively, but they can be mechanisms for sustaining exploitative power differentials, as Anthony Costello warns, but they can also provide the context for fair, respectful, and mutually beneficial collaboration. And improvements could expand the scope of research beyond the dominant paradigm, which is part of what we're going to show you in a couple of minutes. Second, there's an evolution of fair partnerships in research, I think, from the concept, from invoking the idea, to benchmarks, to saying, no, it's not enough to just invoke the idea. We also have to kind of lay out some ways of knowing whether we've actually arrived there through some benchmarks, to the recognition in implementation science, and I think elsewhere, certainly in some of the development literature like the Nature paper I showed you, that fairness should be an integral aspect of how research partnerships are designed, managed, and evaluated, not just an aspirational principle, but something that's really baked into the way that we operate. So the key challenge for realizing the full ethical potential of fair partnerships lies in how to design fair partnership models and how to design the implementation strategies that they will have to use. So I want to turn now to some thoughts about integrating stakeholder engagement and fair partnerships into global health implementation programs. That's really the core thrust of most of our work at the moment. So we have this kind of fun little program that we're trying to get off the ground. It's in nascent form, but we're doing really well, I think, on some of our research funding and contracting, but we haven't been able to build up the learning platform to the extent that we'd like, and that's something that we're going to try to keep working on. But these are the sort of 4 main areas that occupy our time at the moment: stakeholder engagement and organizational learning, fair partnerships, knowledge co-production strategies, and an approach that we call broker design that's really been sort of spearheaded by Lee Wilkers from our team. And I want to just show you a couple of examples. I'm going to start with this one that's really focused primarily on stakeholder engagement and organizational learning. And this is about improving mass drug administration for lymphatic filariasis in Haiti. And this is a project that's been done in partnership with the Ministry of Health of Haiti, the Carter Center. Some of the work's been funded by the UK Aid and some partnerships with Core NTD at the Task Force for Global Health. And this, you can read all about it. I didn't put a link in, but this is open access. This work was led by Brianna Wadnick from our team. It's published in PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases. And the work focuses on lymphatic filariasis, which is a really horrible disease, sometimes referred to as elephantiasis. It's still transmitted in some parts of Haiti. And we were brought in by the Carter Center on this project because of this problem here. The red horizontal dotted line are the kind of WHO targets for coverage in mass drug administration. So the proportion of the total population, eligible population that takes drugs through a mass drug administration. And what they were seeing was a year-over-year decline in the annual lymphatic filariasis MDA coverage in urban Port-au-Prince. And so what we did is we went out and talked to a bunch of people. We talked to a lot of internal stakeholders to the program, the directors, the drug distributors, what they're called promoters and the leaders of those teams, and some of the managers throughout the organization through the program. And then we talked to a bunch of people who either decided they wanted to take the drugs or that they had decided not to take the drugs or they were uncertain, just to get a sense about, see if we could figure out what was going on, what contributed to this decline in coverage. And I should say that there's lots of other work going on this as well. We weren't the only ones working on this, but we did have, the Carter Center thought that we might have a bit of a unique perspective given what I've told you already. So this is part of the analysis, what we discovered. We were really hearing things about program inputs and mechanisms, so different elements and features and mechanisms of the program. We were hearing things that we characterized as mediating factors, potential modifiers of program inputs and mechanisms. We were hearing stuff about stakeholders' experience of the program, the ways that they experienced the program and those mediating factors. We were hearing stuff about stakeholders' reasoning, how stakeholders were making sense of the program. And all of those were kind of accumulating into the impact on the program outcomes. So when we think about a cascade like this, we really tend to think primarily about the program inputs and the impact on program outcomes. And one of the things that I think made this work successful was that we were actually much more focused on these internal issues here about the mediating factors, the stakeholder experience of the program and stakeholders' reasoning and their influence on the ultimate outcomes. And I want to show you an exploded version. It's very simple, but just to give you one really simple example about how this ties together. And so if you start at the left under the program inputs, we heard a lot about the availability of water to help people take the pills, and they're distributed in these little plastic bags. So one of the program input features was about the availability of water and stocking or distribution posts. It actually got relatively little consideration, and it was a big issue for the drug distribution teams. What we heard a lot from people who were either some people who took the drugs and some people who didn't take the drugs was that they often found the distribution posts in dirty surroundings with water bags on the ground, and they didn't like this. So their experience of the program was that this was quite unprofessional, and that they had a kind of general aversion to dirty surroundings. And then their reasoning about this, how they made sense of the program, was that this doesn't appear to be a serious medical intervention, and the dirty surroundings really seem to be incompatible with this idea of taking medicines for an important and difficult disease. And on the impact on the program outcome side, we heard about individual refusals, we heard about rationales for refusals and how they disseminate through social networks. And then we heard also at a higher level about the loss of confidence in the program among partners and funders. But almost always, I would say, and I mean, that might be a lot, but I think what happens is that people just talked about whether the water's there, whether it's getting there, and then they jump straight to the impact on program outcomes without getting deeper into the space about the stakeholder interests and finding targets about how we might kind of mitigate some of those concerns and how we might create value for the stakeholders in a sense by trying to address some of these issues. So we argue that, organizational learning, the ways of trying to bring these insights from stakeholders into the organization can provide the link between the discovery of stakeholders' interests through stakeholder engagement and organizational responses through the design and management of effective learning within the partnership or the program. And we're currently working in a partnership with the Haiti Ministry of Health and the Carter Center to address some of the insights that are arising from this, arising in the stakeholder engagement to improve MDA outcomes in precisely the ways that I've described, that we're working really closely to try to help figure out whether there are ways of tweaking design. And they just finished a really highly effective next round of MDA in December. And so that's just been a wonderful collaboration for us. The last example that I'm going to share is an example that focuses primarily on fair partnerships and also stakeholder engagement and organizational learning. And this is really the title of the talk today, Fair Partnerships as a Determinant of Global Health Campaign Effectiveness. This is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and our partners are the Council for Health Research for Development, the Health Campaign Effectiveness Coalition at the Task Force for Global Health, ASPEN, which is the Afro region of WHO, NTD group, and then the Haiti Ministry, Carter Center, and the Task Force. So a few years ago, I wrote this paper with Carol Azomaden. So among many other things, he's a Hopkins grad, did his MPH at Hopkins. He's currently the executive director of the Council for Health Research for Development. And his chair, the chair of CORED, is my former boss, Jerry Kirsch, which is kind of why I got sort of dragged into this space and I'm now on the board of CORED USA. And the paper essentially is arguing that fair partnerships are about establishing fair terms of cooperation and collaboration between and among programs and stakeholders pursuing joint ventures or mutual goals. Again, just fairness as a proxy, if you like, for a rich and deeper set of ethical considerations. We argue that the dominant paradigm of research ethics, as I've laid it out for you here, is essentially silent on the importance of fairness as an ethical goal for the principal vehicle, partnerships, through which global health research and implementation programs are delivered. And we argue that the Research Fairness Initiative, which I'll tell you about in a second, can fill this critical gap in global research ethics by providing a conceptual architecture and practical tools to help organizations assess the readiness for fair partnership. So what is the RFI? So the RFI really is about creating a reporting system that allows governments and businesses and organizations and funders to describe how they take measures to create trusting, lasting, transparent, and effective partnerships. I also should just say, I just checked the time. I don't know if anyone wants to give me a call out, but I think I'm actually probably quite long. So
yeah,
should I just wrap it up?
If it's possible, that would be great to give us a few minutes for questions. Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah. So, so essentially what we're going to try to do is take this framework and apply it prospectively with some partners in global health campaigns, and then try to take it into a number of different organizations to see what it looks like to try to incorporate this type of reasoning into practice in global health organizations. Sorry for going long. I'll just stop there, stop sharing, and leave you in suspense about what else is in there. And I do apologize for going long. I think I have been told before that I do tend to talk quite a lot. So.
No worries at all. And thanks very much, Jim, for sharing that talk today. We do have a few moments for questions, so I'd like to take some from attendees. So let me first go to the first one on the list here, which is if you could maybe say a little bit more about the elements of fairness in conceptualization of fair partnership. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. So those are the slides that were just coming. The Research Fairness Initiative is really broken into three main domains. One is what we call fairness and opportunity. So a sort of fair equality of opportunity kind of idea that often happens kind of at the front end of research partnerships. The second is just ensuring fairness in process or fairness in procedures. And that can be through contracting, through IP, through all kinds of other sort of dimensions of partnerships, and they're all reflected. And then the final one is fair distributions of the benefits and kind of burdens or costs, if you like, of the partnerships. And each of those three domains has 5 associated topics, and each topic has 3 specific indicators that function as a kind of reporting framework.
Thanks. Maybe I could throw 2 questions at you if you don't mind. One
Sure.
from Brian Hutler in the chat, and then one that I had actually. So Brian's is asking if you thought about the application of this work in other contexts, specifically, to implementation of public health policies. So thinking maybe outside of research ethics, strictly speaking. And then my question was about sort of how your thoughts on this sort of heterogeneity of stakeholders generally, but that we tend to talk about stakeholders as a unified group or sometimes, and that there are these kinds of structural influences within and across stakeholders and what gets heard and what doesn't, really strong forces that play in terms of researchers and what's prioritized by researchers and respond to sort of, at the end of the day, are people just responsive to funders and timely publication and their own disciplinary norms and expectations, or do they really, like, how do you prioritize different stakeholder groups and interests within this framework? Anyway,
Yeah, let me start there then, Joe. So the answer, I think, is yes. And for, probably a bunch of sensible reasons, these things tend not to be funded the way Coca-Cola funds its stakeholder engagement. And so we work in the models, I think, large degree reflect how well we value these things. We value them in a very narrow ways, and that gets us stuck, I think, in not really being able to push too much further. On the point about the way that we conceptualize community or stakeholders, I think we tend to look at communities in 2 ways. One is kind of as geographically bound. We tend to think about a community in geographic terms. It's those folks that sit in whatever the specific geography is that we're interested in. And also we tend to think about community as reflecting established pre-existing sets of relationships or associations among those people sitting in that geography. And of course, one of the things that we've learned over 20 years of looking at case studies and things is that that's just not how it plays out. There are stakeholders who are legitimate stakeholders in every sense that are remote from the geography and don't have pre-existing associations. And we've also seen lots of examples where a specific research project actually creates its own unique set of stakeholders who have a specific interest or interest at stake in the project, and they don't necessarily map to the geographic and pre-existing associations. Of course, there's lots and lots of overlap in that, but I think that that's a confusion, a conceptual confusion that we really struggle with. And if you compare that to a company has its value chain, it has customers, it has suppliers, it has partners across its value chain. It knows precisely who they are and what their specific role and interest is with respect to the company. We don't have that luxury. It's much more diffuse, I think, in research, especially complex, large-scale implementation projects. So I think it's something that, how do you take a model that works effectively in one way and try to extend it into an area that's very poorly resourced and much more complex in lots of legitimate ways.
Well, I think we're running up to the end of the hour here. I just want to point you maybe to a couple of comments that have come in here. In addition to Brian's about extension into public health, there's a comment about sort of when you sort of can tell that stakeholder engagement has been adequately undertaken, given the kind of evolving nature of stakeholder interests and groups. And then, I think somebody else just adding a vote of interest and support for your work on implementation science and connecting that in.
Well, maybe just one quick thought on Brian's comment, which may map a little bit to some of the others. We're just about to get underway with a project. In fact, one of the partners in this project is Dan Salmon and his team at Hopkins, where we're going to be applying our broker design model, which essentially is most of those elements that I described, looking at vaccine hesitancy in the United States, and in particular, looking at how to elicit insights from a wide range of different stakeholders that may really function as kind of design parameters for public health messaging. And so that's, I think, an application that we're just about to get underway.
All right, well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up, and just thank you again, Jim, for joining us today, and thanks everybody for attending. We look forward to everyone joining the next seminar in a couple of weeks, but thanks again, Jim.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Take care.